There are moments in professional sports when a single press conference reveals more about the true state of a franchise than an entire month of game film ever could. Moments where the carefully constructed walls of public relations language begin to crack, where the rehearsed talking points start to crumble under the weight of honest questioning, and where the raw, unfiltered reality of a struggling organization bleeds through every carefully chosen word and every telling pause. What happened in the immediate aftermath of the Indiana Fever's historically humiliating blowout loss to the Atlanta Dream was one of those moments. This was not just another disappointing defeat added to a growing list of frustrating performances. This was a catastrophic collapse that sent shockwaves through the entire WNBA community and forced every serious basketball analyst to ask a question that is becoming increasingly difficult to avoid. Is Indiana Fever head coach Stephanie White running out of answers? And more alarmingly, is she beginning to quietly admit that fact to the entire basketball world without even fully realizing she is doing it? Because when you sit down and methodically dissect the post-game press conference that followed this devastating loss, when you strip away the diplomatic language and the coaching cliches, and you examine the actual substance of what was communicated, a deeply troubling picture begins to emerge. A picture of a coaching staff that appears tactically exhausted, strategically rigid, and fundamentally disconnected from the very player who represents the most valuable asset in the history of this franchise. Today, we are placing every single significant quote from that press conference under the microscope. We are not here to pile on for the sake of criticism. We are not here to manufacture controversy where none exists. We are here because the Indianapolis faithful deserve honest analysis, because Caitlin Clark deserves better than what she is currently receiving, and because the contrast between the head coach's explanations and her rookie point guard's post-game clarity tells a story that every Indiana Fever fan needs to hear. So let us start at the very beginning and work our way through the anatomy of a collapse. When the media gathered in the post-game press conference and directed their first serious question towards Stephanie White, asking her specifically about the catastrophic third quarter that essentially handed the Atlanta Dream the victory on a silver platter, her response centered around one particular statistical metric. She pointed to turnovers. White explained that the Fever committed 9 turnovers in that critical third quarter alone, that the Atlanta Dream converted those mistakes into 11 direct points, and that Indiana simply could not recover because they lacked the transition defense necessary to absorb that kind of momentum swing. Now, on the surface, if you are a casual observer of basketball, that explanation sounds perfectly reasonable. It even sounds somewhat sophisticated. Turnovers lead to fast break opportunities. Fast break opportunities lead to easy baskets. Easy baskets swing momentum. Momentum shifts change the entire emotional complexion of a game. This is fundamental basketball logic that even a recreational player understands. But here is where serious basketball analysis demands that we push significantly deeper than the surface-level explanation. Why are those turnovers happening in the first place? Are we genuinely supposed to believe that professional athletes at the highest level of women's basketball are simply throwing the ball away carelessly, making random errors born entirely from individual lapses in judgment? Or is there a far more systemic explanation hiding beneath the convenient turnover narrative? When an offensive scheme lacks meaningful off-ball movement, when there are no dynamic screening actions forcing defenders to make difficult decisions, when the floor spacing is so fundamentally compromised that opposing defenses can comfortably collapse on the primary ball handler without any fear of being punished elsewhere on the floor, turnovers become an inevitability. They are not random occurrences. They are the predictable, mathematically certain byproduct of a broken offensive system. If a coaching staff designs an offensive scheme that consistently requires Caitlin Clark to manufacture plays under extreme duress, threading passes through multiple converging defenders simply to initiate any kind of meaningful action, then the turnovers that result from those impossible situations are not primarily a reflection of player failure. They are a direct indictment of the scheme that created those impossible situations in the first place. This is a critical distinction that Stephanie White's turnover explanation conveniently sidesteps. She identifies the symptom with statistical precision, but demonstrates a troubling reluctance to honestly confront the root cause. And that pattern of explanation, acknowledging what went wrong while carefully avoiding genuine accountability for why it went wrong, becomes even more pronounced as the press conference continues. The next significant exchange of that post-game press conference produced what might be upon careful reflection, the single most revealing coaching admission of the entire evening. When pressed specifically about the team's defensive awareness and their inability to maintain competitive focus during the Atlanta Dream's devastating run, Stephanie White offered a word that should immediately arrest the attention of every serious Indiana Fever observer. She said her team became disconnected. Let that word sit for a moment before we move forward, because it is carrying an enormous amount of weight that deserves genuine unpacking. Stephanie White, the head coach of a professional basketball franchise operating in one of the most competitive women's sports leagues on the planet, sat in front of a room full of journalists and openly acknowledged that when the pressure intensified, when the game reached its most critical inflection point, her team stopped anticipating, lost their awareness, and became mentally and tactically disconnected from the game plan. The specific language she used was that the team was not as active, not as aware, and not anticipating as much once the Dream began their momentum-building run. Here is the fundamental leadership question that this admission demands we ask directly and without diplomatic softening. When a team starts exhibiting those exact warning signs on the floor in real time, when the body language shifts, when the defensive rotations begin breaking down, when the communication disappears and the cohesion evaporates, whose specific job is it to intervene? Whose responsibility is it to recognize that emotional and tactical deterioration while it is actively happening? Call an immediate timeout, gather the players at the sideline, and forcefully reestablish the focus, the intensity, and the strategic clarity that the moment demands. That responsibility belongs first and exclusively to the head coach. Yet Stephanie White's explanation frames the disconnection as something that simply happened to her team, as though it were an external weather event that descended upon them without warning, rather than a correctable momentum shift that aggressive in-game coaching could have interrupted and reversed. When a head coach consistently describes their team's mental and tactical collapses in passive terms, when they speak about disconnection as something that occurred rather than something that was allowed to occur because of insufficient real-time coaching intervention, it raises a deeply uncomfortable question about the fundamental nature of the leadership being provided. Elite head coaches in professional basketball do not merely observe their teams becoming disconnected. They attack disconnection aggressively with timeouts, substitution patterns designed to inject energy, defensive adjustments that simplify the game plan and reduce cognitive load on struggling players, and direct, specific communication that reminds their team exactly what the game plan requires in that precise moment. They are not passengers watching the car drift toward the guardrail. They are drivers who yank the wheel back toward the center of the road. The language Stephanie White used to describe her team's third-quarter collapse suggests a concerning passivity at the most critical coaching moments of the game. And that passivity, combined with what came next in that press conference, begins to paint a very specific and very troubling portrait of where this coaching staff currently stands. Here is where the post-game narrative takes a genuinely dramatic turn, because when the microphone shifted from the head coach to her rookie point guard, the entire tone, the entire intellectual substance, and the entire emotional honesty of the press conference underwent a remarkable transformation. Caitlin Clark had just delivered a 26-point performance shooting over 60% from the floor. By any objective individual metric, she had done everything a franchise player is supposed to do in a professional basketball game. She had attacked the basket, created shots for herself and her teammates, and performed at an elite level despite the team's comprehensive collapse around her. And yet, when Clark sat down at the podium, the very first thing she did was take full, unequivocal, zero excuses accountability for her turnovers. She did not point to the defensive pressure. She did not mention the lack of spacing. She did not reference her teammates' positioning or the officiating or any of the external factors that a player of her statistical stature would be entirely justified in raising. She simply said, in plain and direct language, that she needs to take better care of the ball and that responsibility belongs entirely to her. That is genuine leadership. That is the kind of accountability that professional basketball demands from players who aspire to define franchises and inspire teammates, and build the kind of locker room culture that ultimately produces winning basketball. But Clark did not stop at simple accountability. She then proceeded to deliver a piece of post-game basketball analysis that was, quite frankly, more tactically sophisticated and more directly useful than anything offered by the coaching staff during the same press conference. Clark identified with surgical precision exactly why the Fever's offense completely collapsed in the second half. She explained that what worked in the first half was playing in transition, spreading the floor, and finding open teammates before defenses could set up. She then identified the specific mechanism that destroyed that entire offensive approach in the second half. When the Fever's defense was constantly committing fouls, and the Atlanta Dream was repeatedly converting free throws, Indiana was forced to inbound the ball from underneath the Atlanta basket repeatedly, completely eliminating any opportunity to push the tempo or initiate any kind of transition offense. She described this with the precise clarity of a player who not only has extraordinary individual talent, but possesses a basketball intelligence that allows her to understand the game at a systemic and strategic level. She was not just identifying what happened. She was explaining the exact causal chain of events that turned a competitive first half into a catastrophic second half collapse. The critical question that this contrast demands we confront honestly is this: if the rookie point guard is capable of diagnosing the team's fundamental tactical problems with this level of clarity and precision in a post-game press conference, why is the coaching staff apparently unable to identify and address those same problems during the actual game itself? Why did the coaching staff's post-game explanation focus on turnovers as a surface-level symptom, while their 26-year-old rookie was connecting the deeper tactical dots between defensive fouling patterns and offensive rhythm destruction? The answer to that question matters enormously for the future direction of this franchise. When the press conference returned its focus to Stephanie White and reporters asked her specifically about the Fever's chronic foul problem, and whether it represented something correctable or simply a product of officiating trends, her response demonstrated a masterful command of the art of deflection. White began by acknowledging that there has been a league-wide officiating emphasis on freedom of movement calls, suggesting that the Fever's foul numbers are at least partially a function of the referee's whistle, rather than exclusively a product of the team's defensive approach. She then briefly mentioned that individually and collectively, the players need to find ways to avoid putting themselves in vulnerable defensive positions. Now, it is technically accurate that officiating emphases shift throughout a season, and that those shifts affect foul numbers across the entire league. This is a real phenomenon that genuine basketball analysis must acknowledge honestly. But here is the fundamental problem with leaning on that explanation as a meaningful response to the Fever's defensive crisis. Every single team in the WNBA is playing under those exact same officiating emphases. Every team is navigating those exact same freedom of movement calls. Every team is dealing with those exact same referee tendencies. And yet, the Indiana Fever consistently find themselves at the very bottom of the league's defensive metrics, giving up historically embarrassing point totals night after night. If the officiating environment were truly the primary explanation for the Fever's defensive struggles, every team in the league would be experiencing similar defensive breakdowns. They are not. Which means the officiating explanation, while not entirely without merit, is being used to absorb a disproportionate share of blame that more honestly belongs elsewhere. White's comment about players needing to have each other's backs to avoid vulnerable defensive positions also deserves careful scrutiny, because the question that immediately follows is a simple but devastating one. How exactly are players supposed to have each other's backs when the defensive rotational system they are operating within is fundamentally broken? When a team's initial point of attack defense fails to contain the ball handler, and the secondary help defense is either non-existent or arriving too late to be useful, the players left scrambling to prevent easy baskets are not failing because of laziness or disinterest or a lack of professionalism. They are failing because the defensive system has already broken down at a structural level that leaves them with no good options. Committing a foul becomes the least terrible choice available when the entire defensive architecture has already collapsed. That is not exclusively a player execution problem. That is a scheme problem. And calling it exclusively a player execution problem, as Stephanie White's explanation implicitly does, represents a form of blame redistribution that a coaching staff in genuine crisis should not be engaging in. Everything we have discussed up to this point, the turnover deflection, the passive disconnection language, the officiating excuse, the player execution framing, all of it was concerning. All of it raised legitimate questions, but none of it quite prepared us for what came next. When a reporter asked Stephanie White directly about how the Fever's persistent foul trouble had forced her to modify or adapt her defensive schemes, her response stopped the entire basketball analytical community in its tracks. She said, with remarkable casualness given the magnitude of what she was admitting, that there are only so many schemes you can do. Read that again slowly, because it deserves to be fully absorbed before we proceed. There are only so many schemes you can do. The head coach of the Indiana Fever, speaking to the media after a catastrophic blowout loss that exposed every structural weakness her team possesses, stated openly and without apparent awareness of how devastating her own admission was, that her tactical playbook has essentially reached its limits, that the schemes available to her are finite, and that she has essentially exhausted the options at her disposal. In the context of elite professional basketball coaching, this statement is absolutely extraordinary. Consider what the most respected and successful coaches in the professional game, both in the WNBA and across the broader basketball landscape, understand as the foundational truth of their craft. Coaching at the highest level is a perpetual intellectual arms race. It is a relentless chess match that demands constant evolution, constant adaptation, and a limitless willingness to innovate in response to what opposing teams are doing to attack your weaknesses. The elite coaches in this game deploy zone defenses in creative and unexpected configurations to disrupt opposing offenses that have become comfortable attacking man coverage. They implement sophisticated trapping schemes at specific moments of the shot clock to force rushed decisions. They use box and one variations to take a specific offensive player completely out of their rhythm. They adjust their pick and roll coverage principles based on individual matchup analysis, sometimes dropping their big into the paint, sometimes going over the screen aggressively, sometimes switching everything, sometimes blitzing the ball handler and rotating quickly to recover. These are not exotic tactical innovations available only to a select few. These are standard tools of the professional coaching trade. They are precisely the kind of adjustments that a struggling defensive team desperately needs when their base defensive scheme is being systematically exploited by opposing offenses week after week. And yet the head coach of the Indiana Fever just told the entire basketball world, in plain and unambiguous language, that she is essentially out of tools, that she has reached the ceiling of her tactical imagination, that the remaining solution is not a new scheme or a creative defensive adjustment, but rather a higher level of intentionality and discipline from the players executing the existing scheme. Let us be completely fair and honest about what this means. Demanding greater discipline and intentionality from your players is always a legitimate coaching expectation. Players at the professional level are absolutely responsible for executing their assignments with precision and consistency. Coaching staff cannot be blamed for every individual defensive mistake that a fully professional athlete makes. But when a team is consistently failing to execute the same scheme at the same critical moments game after game, week after week, the responsible analytical question is not exclusively about player discipline. It is about whether the scheme itself is appropriately matched to the capabilities, the instincts, and the physical attributes of the players being asked to execute it. If your players are consistently arriving late to their defensive rotations, as White herself acknowledged, there are two possible explanations. Either the players are consistently failing to apply the effort and concentration necessary to execute a scheme that is genuinely achievable for them, or the scheme is too complex, too demanding, or too fundamentally misaligned with the personnel roster for the players to realistically execute it at a professional level regardless of their effort or focus. When the answer to chronic execution failures is always more discipline and more intentionality rather than schematic simplification or creative adaptation, a head coach is essentially telling you that they believe their system is correct and their players are the problem. Every single time, without exception. At some point, the weight of that pattern shifts the analytical burden back onto the coaching staff with significant and undeniable force. What this press conference ultimately revealed, in ways that perhaps even its participants did not fully intend, is a fundamental clash of basketball philosophies operating within the same franchise simultaneously. On one side of this philosophical divide, you have Caitlin Clark, a generational talent who was recruited, developed, and reached elite professional status within a specific kind of offensive system. A system built on relentless pace, sophisticated read and react decision-making, complex off-ball movement, and the kind of fluid ball movement that creates genuine open shots for multiple players simultaneously. Clark's entire basketball identity is built around seeing the floor at a level that allows her to find and exploit gaps before defenses can recover. She processes information at a speed that allows her to make the right pass, the right shot decision, and the right driving lane identification almost simultaneously. This kind of player thrives when the surrounding system is built to complement and leverage that processing speed. She thrives in transition. She thrives in secondary break situations. She thrives when the offensive scheme creates movement and reads that keep defenses constantly shifting and guessing. On the other side of this philosophical divide, there appears to be a coaching staff committed to a significantly more static, more predictable, and more isolation-dependent offensive approach. An approach that frequently asks Clark to create not just for herself, but essentially for the entire team out of pick-and-roll actions or isolation sets, without the surrounding off-ball movement and spacing complexity that would make those actions genuinely difficult for opposing defenses to contain. The collision between these two basketball philosophies is not simply an abstract tactical debate. It has real, measurable consequences that show up in the box score every single night. When the offensive system does not complement Clark's natural tendencies and strengths, she is forced to work exponentially harder to generate the same results. The turnovers that result are not random individual errors. They are the predictable consequence of a player being asked to operate in a system that demands she do too much without adequate structural support. And the defensive side of this philosophical collision is equally problematic. If the defense is built on a man coverage scheme that requires individual athletes to consistently win one-on-one battles against elite offensive players without the schematic support of creative zone wrinkles, trapping actions, or unconventional coverages, the chronic foul problem becomes not just understandable but mathematically inevitable. Everything we have analyzed in this breakdown ultimately flows toward a single critical question that the Indiana Fever front office cannot continue to avoid. How long are they willing to allow this situation to continue? Because here is the reality that no amount of diplomatic language or coaching loyalty can obscure. Caitlin Clark is not just a talented young player. She is a once-in-a-generation phenomenon whose impact on the WNBA's growth, visibility, commercial success, and cultural relevance is already unprecedented and will continue to expand as her career develops. The opportunity that her presence creates for this franchise is not merely significant. It is the kind of organizational foundation-building opportunity that comes along perhaps once in the lifetime of a sports franchise. And right now, that opportunity is being systematically squandered. Clark is doing everything within her power. She is delivering elite individual performances. She is taking accountability publicly and privately. She is diagnosing the team's problems with a clarity that exceeds what is being demonstrated by the coaching staff. She is, by every available measure, operating at the absolute ceiling of what any individual player can do within a system that is not built to support her strengths. But she is pushing a boulder up a mountain. And based on that press conference, the people standing at the top of that mountain appear to believe that the solution is for her to push harder, rather than examining whether the mountain itself needs to be reshaped. When a head coach publicly acknowledges that her team is becoming disconnected at critical moments without accepting direct accountability for failing to interrupt that disconnection through active coaching interventions, that is a leadership concern. When a head coach deflects to officiating trends and player discipline deficiencies as the primary explanations for chronic defensive failures, without presenting any meaningful new schematic approaches to address those failures, that is a strategic concern. And when a head coach sits in front of the media following a historically embarrassing loss and states, essentially without qualification, that there are only so many schemes available to her, that is an organizational crisis alarm that cannot be rationalized away or softened by loyalty or patience or the hope that things will naturally improve. Elite coaching is defined by an inexhaustible willingness to find new answers when the current answers are not working. It is defined by creative problem solving under pressure. It is defined by the refusal to accept tactical stagnation as an acceptable state of affairs when a team is losing badly and losing consistently. There are only so many schemes you can do is not the statement of a coach who still has answers to find. It is the statement of a coach who has concluded that the answers do not exist. And in professional basketball, the moment a coaching staff reaches that conclusion, the team's competitive trajectory has already been determined. The Indiana Fever post-game press conference following their devastating loss to the Atlanta Dream was not just a routine media obligation. It was an unintentional and deeply revealing window into the genuine state of a franchise that is standing at a crossroads of enormous consequence. The quotes we analyzed today were not fabricated or taken out of context. They were direct, specific statements made by the head coach of a professional basketball team who appears, based on her own words, to be operating at or near the limits of her tactical capacity. And they were contrasted with the post-game clarity of a rookie point guard who demonstrated, in her handful of sentences at that same podium, a level of basketball intelligence and strategic insight that should be informing the coaching staff's approach rather than simply serving as a reminder of how much talent is currently being mismanaged. Stephanie White's admission that there are only so many schemes available to her is a coaching philosophy exposed in its most raw and honest form. It tells us precisely where this staff's ceiling is located. It tells us that if the current game plan fails, there is no meaningful plan B waiting in reserve. And it tells us that the explanation for continued failure will remain consistent. The players need to execute better, be more disciplined, be more intentional, be more connected. But connection does not emerge from repetition alone. Discipline does not automatically produce winning basketball when the scheme being executed with discipline is fundamentally unsuited to the personnel roster. And tactical exhaustion at the coaching level is not a problem that player effort can solve, no matter how extraordinary the player doing the efforting happens to be. The fans in Indianapolis see this. The analysts see this. And based on the sharp, unvarnished honesty she brought to that post-game podium, it is becoming increasingly clear that Caitlin Clark sees it too. The only remaining question is whether the people with the organizational authority to change the direction of this franchise will see it before the most important rookie season in WNBA history slips irretrievably away. Because in professional sports, opportunities like the one Caitlin Clark represents do not wait indefinitely for organizational competence to catch up. And white flags, no matter how quietly they are waved, are still white flags. Thank you for reading this full breakdown. The quotes have been laid out, the analysis has been applied, and the hard questions have been asked directly. Now the conversation belongs to you. Does Stephanie White's admission that the tactical options are exhausted prove she is the wrong coach for this roster? Are the Indiana Fever actively wasting the most historically significant rookie season the WNBA has ever witnessed by refusing to adapt? Share your honest thoughts in the comments below. Every single perspective matters in this conversation.